to the channel. We have a video on how to get on-screen buttons to work for your game object. And what I mean by this is moving the actual game object. In this demo, you're going to see the game object move left and right by pressing the two buttons here, left and right. Kind of see them labeled right button, left button. So as a little demonstration before we get into the workings inside the editor of Defold, go right, players moving, stop, players stop. We go left, players moving, and we stop. So you kind of see the labels changing, player moving left, player moving right. These are just little flags just to kind of show me that I'm actually doing something. So that's the only reason why you see those there. But you see our little player object moving left and right as we pressed. So let's go ahead and get into the editor and see how I have achieved all this. Alright, so now we are in the editor. Here we have a number of different windows open. Let's make them a little bit bigger. Alright, so we have our collection. We have two scripts, and then we have a game object that I created in the assets panel rather than within the collection, just to make it easier and cleaner for me to work on a game object before having to go into the collection. So that's why I do that. And of course, to create any assets, you just right click on a folder, go to new, and you got all different types of assets that you can create. But as you can see, I've already have the assets created, so we're just going to get into how I got everything set up. Well, actually, we also have a GUI. So the GUI here, really simple. Just created two box nodes. And just left them as the defaults, so that way they just populate onto this game screen with the player. Label them left and right, just so there's a differentiation between the two. And that's really it for the GUI. The player object, of course, we have our sprite. That's just a basic in-engine sprite, so nothing crazy, just to get the demo out, just to show that. So you get the sprite, we have our player script here, and then of course we have our GUI script for our GUI that we created. So that's it for the player game object. So let's go into the collection first, and then we'll go into the scripts, since the scripts are a little bit longer in terms of explaining. So within our collection, I have those labels. It's left and right, just so I know what's left and what's right. Then I have the player game object within our collection here. Of course, to add stuff, game objects, add game object. Since I have our game object already created for the player, I just go to game object file, add that in there. So that's that for as far as those setups. So let's go ahead and get into the scripting part to get everything functionality wise working properly. So we are going to start in the GUI script, as that's where you have to set up the registering the functionality of your buttons. So first and foremost, I just want to point out that I did get this information from the public examples of one of the creators of Defold. So I got all this information from him and kind of just made it my own to get things working properly. All right, so now we're looking at our GUI script here. Just to reiterate again, I did get this from the public examples section from one of the gentlemen that created Defold that has a bunch of examples on how to do things. I did get that from here. I tweaked it a little bit to go towards what I needed to achieve. So let's go ahead and go through how I was able to get those button presses to move our character right and left. So we start up top here with our little post to listener. This just is telling you to listen out for whatever messages is being sent out via the different functions that we have down below it. So first one here we have on control left. So when you hit the left button. Second is on control right when you hit that right button. So here we have different types of parameters that we're looking at. We got touch and control. Of course, self is one of those global ones that almost everything gets as a function. So with that, we essentially what we're doing is the same thing with the inputs. This is kind of how I'm seeing it. We're basically setting this up, but we're hard coding it to our specifications to those GUI buttons rather than having key buttons. Of course, right now they don't have input buttons to put like, say, like a button, like a GUI button, and say to when you tap it, you do this or whatever. So we're hard coding what we want the buttons to do. So that way, when we press them, they do that certain action. So for me, when I have the button left pressed, so that's going to be the message that's going to be sent out. So you get that message ID. So that's going to be the message sent out to our player script when we want the left button to do something. So when it's pressed, the X value is going to be 1. When it's released, the X value is going to be 0. And of course, true is for both of them because when you press it, the press is true, and when it's released, the release is true. Just like when it comes to action IDs on input, you are the actions you have pressed, released, repeated. So when it's pressed, you register one press. When it's released, you register the release. When it's repeated, you were registering that the key or button is being held down. So that's the same case here. Press, released, repeated if you needed to use repeated for anything. I just have press and released. And of course, that's the same for control right. Only difference is we're using the message ID of button right. Here with the find control for XY, that's basically like when you have a GUI button, you have that, if we had on input, you would see, so it's like you would see um, action.x, action.y when it comes to a button for where you want to press stuff. That's what you're seeing here for find control for XY. It's opening a table that our buttons are going to be contained in, and those nodes will have X and Y return what is being pressed. So that's what you kind of see there. At least that's how I got from it. The touch index is basically saying, is the button being touched? If it's touched, then we return something. If it's not touched, then we're not returning anything. Now with the register, this is where you register the actual button. So that way, once it gets set into the player script, you know exactly what button's being pressed. So this one actually is not needed because that one involves the analog stick, which I haven't done yet, but I think I may try to do that in the future because the example has an analog stick. So I may try that in the future, but right now we're just worrying about buttons, trying to keep it simple to the point, so that way we know what we're doing, and that way we can improve and further things as we go along. So here we have that register function. That self.controls node is adding in the whatever nodes we put into it, that it must return a node, it must return a press state and the function. So we go down here into our initialize function, and we have that register. So we register the GUI itself, what node we're looking at, and the function that that node is supposed to take on. So on control left. So on control left would be for our left button. On control right would be for our right button. Here, if you wanted to release the input, say like you disabled the GUI button within like the game, That way, once you release the input, so once the GUI has been destroyed, you can't be able to touch anything to allow the buttons to keep moving. Once it's released, once the GUI has been destroyed, then it's released. You can't register anything additional. Then we move on to the on message. So we're registering and unregistering. So when we register, we're registering the senders of the script, which is that on control left, on control right. And then when we want to unregister, we were making sure that nothing is being registered. So that way everything is null and void. So you can't do anything crazy if you don't want anything crazy to be done. This handle touch is what's going to get put down into the on input. So handle touch is just going through and saying if something is touched, you're looking for that particular function, getting the touch.x, touch.y. So just like I said, if you hit an on input for a GUI function like a main menu, you would see action.x, action.y from here. So that's why it's doing the same thing, but we're just calling it touch just to make it a little bit more crisp and easy to understand because it's something outside of the on input function. We have a number of different things. Control.pressed equals true. So when it's pressed, we're saying that the control of the function is true, looking at the touch index, and then getting what the function is. Same thing with release, talking about the same things, but of course in the opposite direction. So false, nil, so no touch is happening. And that's when you get that touch index. So saying, just basically saying like, is there a press on the button? That's the touch index. And then lastly, if the control touch index is true, then we are getting a true on the index. Then lastly, within the GUI script, before we go over to the player script, we have just saying that if action.touch, so if any touch action happens here, we're going through and creating the pairs that goes through. So pairing the button with the node, button with the node, button with the node, and all of its functionality. And of course, when it's no touch, you get a 0. When there's a touch, it's getting those items within the table that we created for our pairs. So on button left goes with button left, on button right goes with button right. So we're good there. We can exit out of that. We'll exit out of the input bindings, and then we'll go into the player script. So the player script is just acting on the little sprite that I have here. So I created some speed just to give an idea, just to get speed. We have to register, initialize, and register the GUI and their buttons. So that's why you see that register here. So that register message, which let me open back up, just so you can get an idea. So you got that register here, register here. So we go through, and this here, we get it put into there. You have the unregister. So like for, let's see, so right here, the register being sent out, unregistered being sent out. Now you kind of see where they end up. So anything that's registered within the initialize function will populate into our script for the player. And if the player is destroyed at any point, then those buttons will become null and void. And the update function here, oh wait, before we go on, you can see the labels that I set, the direction. So it kind of gives the player an idea. Right now it's set to 0, 0, 0, so there's no player movement. And then we'll go through and we'll add that movement on the actual button press. So we're going to set that position. We get the position of our sprite plus the direction that we want it to go times the delta time, so that way we get it frames per second. Now we're into the nitty gritty. This is the last part here. Now we get to where we actually add in that functionality, actually add in that movement, even updating labels if you wanted to try to do that as well. So you'll see messages that are being sent. So the touch press, touch release, those are the messages that get sent from our two button functions. So you'll see message pressed, message.release, saying for button right, so button left, button right. If we go back to our registered functions, you have left, right, on control left, on control right. But then you got here those messages that are sent. So button right, button left. That's where you would get button right, button left. So make sure you remember that. You're looking at these here within the actual function. The ones that come from here involve the node that we put on the GUI and then the function. So that way the function can get attached to the node, and then these messages get sent to our player script that's attached to our game object. So to move the player, we got these lines right here. So we're just worrying about the x-axis. So you got self.direction.x, message x, which is going to be here. You got those messages that get sent via the tables that we created in our post listener. So message.x, which is when it's pressed, is 1 and not pressed is 0. So you can do message.x times speed. To go left, you go in the negative direction. So that's why you see that minus sign there. To go right, you go in the positive direction. So you see no minus sign. But the message.x provides the value that we assigned within our table here to get the message to be, well, to get the direction to be 100, since we have speed as a local global variable of 100. And if we go through, we'll build that project one more time, and you can see again the demonstration of everything, and then we'll be done. If you, as this is loading up, if you do happen to go through everything and mimic what I have done here, leave a like on the video. If something does happen to go wrong or something's not working, you get error messages, leave a comment, and I'll definitely check out and see what's happening and kind of guide you on how to get everything implemented correctly. But once again, we got our game object in the middle, two labels. When we press, player moving right. When we press, player moving left. Wonderful. So, yep, that's how I was able to get everything all set up, get on-screen controls. I'm going to try to make a YouTube short showing it actually working on a cell phone. I do have a couple of Android devices that I have left over from previous because they broke and aren't able to make phone calls, but they're still able to function in terms of playing games. So I kind of use those as little test devices for stuff like this. So I'm gonna try to get a video of me actually doing this demo on an actual device, so you can kind of see me and my hands pressing the buttons and seeing it work just like you did in the game window here. But with that, there's nothing else. So, like I said, leave a like on the video if you happen to get the on-screen controls to work. Leave a comment if something is not going right or you get an error, and we'll definitely go through and try to get it all fixed. But with that, it's game over.